I know that I said in my previous video that I'm going to spend the next couple days working through my abandoned reading list for professional development, but actually the schedule has changed. We're putting these aside for a little bit, and I'm going to talk about Persepolis 2 because I just finished it this afternoon. So review of Persepolis 2 it is, and then we'll try and work through these books in the next couple days after that. So Persepolis 2, the story of a return by, I believe this is pronounced Marjane Satrapi, is a sequel to Persepolis 1. And I've already reviewed Persepolis 1 on this channel before. I'll link to my review of it in the description down below. And a lot of what I said for Persepolis 1 is going to be true for Persepolis 2. But just some quick background to orientate anyone who's not familiar with this comic book. This is a graphic novel, an autobiographical graphic novel of the author, Marjane Satrapi, who talks about her childhood growing up in Iran during and after the Islamic Revolution in 1979. So according to her bio, it looks like Marjane Satrapi was born in 1969, so was still a child when the revolution happened in Iran, and then ended up having her formative years under the repressive religious regime of Iran, and has written her autobiography and comic books, which were published in 2 volumes. But what makes this very readable, what separates this from just a feel-bad story about a dystopian regime, is this is a very human story. I mean, yes, all those feel-bad moments about the dystopian Iranian regime are in there, but there's also just a lot of other human moments in here. Like, let me see if I can find the picture I'm looking for. Like Marjane stumbling on her boyfriend in bed with another woman. As she herself says, it was like a bad American movie. So these and some other juicy soap opera-esque moments in here as well. It's a story of a life with all the twists and turns and human elements and romantic ups and downs that would be true of anybody's life. And, well, perhaps Marjane's life is a little bit more colorful than most people's life, actually. But it's that human element which makes this very interesting. The other interesting thing about Volume 2 is the first half of it takes place in Europe. So at the end of Volume 1, Marjane's parents had sent her off to Austria. The reason was she was causing too many problems in her Iranian school, and they were worried that she would get herself into some permanent trouble with the conservative Iranian regime. She was just too outspoken, and they were worried she would get like a permanent black mark on her record that would cause her a lot of trouble in the future or get arrested or who knows what. So they sent her off to Europe, where she was supposed to live with some relatives, but very quickly those relatives got rid of her and she got put in the dormitory at a conservative Catholic school. And then it's the story of adjusting to life as an expatriate, as a foreigner, and the culture shock, the feeling of being on the outside, the feeling of not fitting in, which makes up the first half of the story. And again, there are a lot of human elements in here, which makes it more than just a feel-bad story. So, for example, her getting kicked out of the nuns' dormitory. So she makes herself some pasta, and she goes down to eat the pasta in the TV room. And she notes that in her in her home in Iran, her parents never allowed her to eat while watching TV. But here in the dormitory, all the students do it. You can eat food while watching TV in Europe. But then suddenly, the Mother Superior blocked my line of vision. A little restraint, mademoiselle. But here everyone eats while watching TV. But not in a pot. What kind of manners are these? It's true what they say about Iranians. They have no education. It's true what they say about you, too. You were all prostitutes before becoming nuns. And then a panel with just everybody staring at her coldly, which leads to her becoming expelled. So Marjane appears to be a very outspoken person. I guess we knew that from the first book, which causes her to get into some situations. Yeah, it's interesting that this first half here. There's a number of interesting things. Long-time maybe viewers of this channel will know I've been interested in the history of Marx and Bakunin and the history of the Commune, the Paris Commune, which is all stuff that Marjane Satrapi ends up studying when she's in Europe, because she falls in with a group of leftist friends who talk about it. And she makes comparisons with her own country. So when reading about the fall of the Paris Commune, she says, I concluded that the French right of this epoch were worthy of my country's fundamentalists. And if you know anything about the Paris Commune and the brutality with which it was put down, you know exactly what she's talking about. She also, when she's talking about the nuns in Austria, she compares them to the extremists in her country. In every religion, you find the same extremists. Yeah, is that a fair comparison or not? Who knows? Maybe. The other thing, I'm jumping from thought to thought as they randomly occur in my head here. But I mentioned in my review of Book 1 that I knew a lot of Iranians. I have known a lot of Iranians over the years living abroad, but especially my year in Melbourne, Australia, I met a lot of Iranians. And a number of the things that they told me line up fairly well with this book. So, for example, one of the things they told me is that despite the regime being so repressive, they had so many house parties in their houses where they broke all the rules. And this is something that's portrayed in this book as well, with her and all her friends having parties in their home. Although not without some trouble. They do get busted a few times, but then they just go right back to the partying. Another thing which I remember from one of my Iranian friends in Melbourne is we were going out for the night one night, me and him, and he so desperately wanted to go to a nightclub. And I tried to tell him, nightclubs really suck. You know, it's just a bunch of loud music, bad loud music. You can't talk to each other. It's not a great way to meet girls unless you're extremely extroverted on the dance floor. But he just really wanted to go to a nightclub. Now, granted, I'm the worst person to be a guide to the nightlife scene in Itty City, especially going to nightclubs. So maybe he would have had more fun if he was with somebody else, because I never know what to do when I get into a nightclub. But I took him to a nightclub. Neither of us really enjoyed it. And then when he left, he said, Hollywood movies have lied to me. I just pictured nightclubs being these really wild, exotic experiences. Anyways, I thought of that when Satrapi goes back home and meets her Iranian girlfriends. And they're so obsessed with nightclubs. They say, well, why don't you tell us what the nightclubs were like? And she said, well, it's just that I don't go that often. I don't really like them much. What? They can't believe she doesn't like the nightclubs. Oh, stop pretending to be so shocked. Don't you remember how she was? There were still nightclubs in Tehran. I'd go there every night. Me too. So yeah, that reminded me of my Iranian friend and how badly he wanted to go to nightclubs when he was in Australia. But there is actually, while I'm talking about my own personal experience with Iranians, there is one thing that he mentioned which is different from this account here. He mentioned he was actually quite shocked when he came to Melbourne, Australia, and how shall I put this delicately? How difficult it was to hook up with a girl. And he mentioned in Tehran, people were having sex all the time. I mean, of course, it wasn't legally sanctioned by the regime or anything like that. But the young people at these house parties that they weren't supposed to have would just end up pairing off. And he gave the impression it was very easy to sleep with girls in Iran if you were with these liberal crowds, which is not the view that Marjane has. She, even though she's from a liberal family, she's quite shocked by how sexually open Austria is and how, her school friends talking about having sex all the time, but she just being very pure and innocent. And yeah, in fact, one of the first times I ever heard of this book, actually, was when I was mentioning to another friend the comment that my Iranian friend had made. And he said, well, that's not the view I got from Persepolis at all. And then I think that was the first time I heard of Persepolis. Anyways, who knows what accounts for that difference, whether my friend was exaggerating, whether things have changed over the years, because I think my friend was about 10 years younger than me, so perhaps about 20 years younger than Marjane. Yeah. Different crowds, who knows? Who knows? So anyways, leaving that aside and getting back to the actual story, after having a pretty horrible experience in Europe, well, sorry, maybe horrible is overselling it, but after having an isolating experience in Europe and ending up getting diagnosed with untreated bronchitis because she'd been sleeping out in the streets during her last few weeks, she comes back home and then has classic reverse culture shock, where she doesn't want to talk to anybody because she can't find any ways to relate her experience to them. They won't understand what it was like for her to be an outsider in Europe. And she feels guilty because they were all suffering from the war. Well, she had escaped that to go to Europe. So she feels bad complaining about what her experience had been in Europe when Iran was still doing the Iran-Iraq war. And her parents fill her in on all the horrors of war that she had missed, which she was completely oblivious to because it hadn't been that big of news back in Europe. And she also mentioned she had intentionally tried to avoid the news while she was there. As the story goes on, we eventually get to the first American war with Iraq after Iraq invaded Kuwait. It's interesting. Again, what's interesting about this book is it just gives you a lot of little interesting details about what it was like. So, for example, she mentions that the Iraqis didn't have any sympathies for the Kuwaitis because I guess they had sided with Saddam Hussein during those years. But people predict that Kuwaiti refugees would show up in Iran, and sure enough, they do. And she says, you know, you could always tell who they were. They had very modern cars. I guess they were rich. And they had no idea about Iranian culture. So they thought she was a prostitute. And when she recounted this incident to an uncle, the uncle told me, there, as in all the Arab countries, women are so lacking in rights that for a Kuwaiti, a girl who walks outside while drinking a Coke can't be anything but a prostitute. So this is an interesting little detail maybe to keep in mind. And I mentioned this in my review of the first Persepolis as well. But I think this is confirmation of it. In some ways, compared to its Arab neighbors, Iran is actually the more liberal Muslim country. I mean, for all the horrors of the repressive regime, which she recounts in this book, not trying to discount any of that. But, you know, like in Saudi Arabia or Kuwait, women didn't have to just wear the shawl. They had to have their whole face covered. They couldn't walk outside by themselves. They had to be accompanied by a male relative, I think. At this time, women couldn't drive in Saudi Arabia or presumably other Arab countries. So it's just worth maybe keeping in mind here, because it's easy to forget, especially if you grew up in the 80s, where Iran was always the bad Muslim country. Worth remembering that some of our allies, like Saudi Arabia, are actually more restrictive. That being said, though, she does talk about how restrictive the regime was and how they were constantly scrutinizing you for everything. And she has the theory that they're not doing it for religious reasons. They're doing it to maintain control. So she said the regime had understood that one person leaving her house were asking herself, "Are my trousers long enough? Can my makeup be seen? Is my veil in place? Are they going to whip me?" No longer asks herself, "Where is my freedom of thought? Where is my freedom of speech? Why my life isn't livable? What's going on in the political prisons?" So that's and yeah, the talking about what it's like living under this repressive regime does make up a good deal of the book. Although it like everything else in the book, it can be tragic. She has friends killed by the regime, but it also can be humorous. So at one point she's running. The class went late, so she has to run to catch the bus, and she gets called out for running. Lady in the blue coat, don't run. Lady in the blue coat, stop running. Hey, blue coat, stop running. And she can't understand why she can't run after the bus. And they say, yes, but when you run, your behind makes movements that are, how do you say, obscene. Well, then don't look at my ass, she yells at them. And she says, I yelled so loudly that they didn't even arrest me. So, yeah. And she meets an Iranian man, and again, this is where we get more into the human drama here. Her friend is actually trying to set the man up with her other friend. So her friend keeps trying to stop them from meeting, but makes her dance, tell her he's a ladies' man. Despite her friend's attempts to sabotage it, she does meet an Iranian man, and they embark on a relationship which has its ups and downs, and they ended up getting married, but then eventually, when the marriage doesn't work, divorced. seems like amicably divorced, but it's another example of how this isn't just a feel-bad book about the repressive regime. It's about life, growing up, falling in love, all the things, falling out of love and getting divorced, and all the things that go into making normal life, well, against the background of what it was like being a student in Iran during this time and all the restrictions they had to live with a lot of humor mixed in, as well as some horrible things that happened. I mean, she had one friend that fell to his death while running from the religious police. She had other friends who were disfigured in the war, etc. So it's a mixture of emotions when you read this book. But one thing you have to say is it's interesting. It's interesting all the way through. So I would certainly recommend it on that account. And I'll leave off here.